It's a pleasure to introduce Yaw Oheneba-Sakyi, who's returning to campus after completing a PhD here 17 years ago. Time flies. He hasn't been back since, so we're delighted that he would be willing to come and talk to us. He completed his undergraduate work at the University of Ghana, then a master's degree in the Sunni system at Albany, and a PhD here, as I mentioned. He's taught courses on race and ethnic diversity in the United States and a variety of courses on Africa. He has received several awards for his research and teaching and has published widely. In fact, the impetus for his visit now is his just completed work on African families at the turn of the 21st century. It's unique because it covers most of Africa, if not all. And the other thing I thought was very interesting about the book is almost all of the authors are African. So it was a requirement that they had to live in Africa for many years and be well experienced before they could write in the book. Well, Yaw is he's enthused about ideas, is always thinking of programs and research, and he's a delightful colleague to have too. And so we'd like to welcome you here. Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised you're not out there enjoying the weather, and you've chosen to come to listen to me. Let me just say a few words before we get any deep. First, I would like to thank Tim, Renetta, Cadell. And remember, I'm calling them by their first names, you know. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have. But I've learned over the last 17 years that I need to tell my own story by moving up to their level. And I believe that by God's grace, I have moved to their level. And not that I have moved to their level, but they have allowed me, through their guidance and inspiration, to move up to their level. There's an African proverb which says that when a child learns how to wash his hands well, he's able to eat with the elderly people. You know, in much of Africa, because of the common nature of the way we live our lives, normally even in dishes is a common pool. I mean, we all eat from the same dish. And if young kids don't learn how to wash their hands well after play or work, then they are not called upon to the table of the elders, right? But when a young kid learns how to wash his hands or her hands well, then he's called upon to eat with the elders. So I'm very grateful that I've been called upon today to eat with the elders. And I'll take this opportunity to present something little for you. But what I want to do is, instead of making a formal presentation, and I was discussing this with our team, I would rather do it semi-formal so that we can get the audience involved, so you don't go to sleep on me. Okay. I know it's about noontime, you know. Some part of the world is siesta time. But since we've chosen not to go out and enjoy the weather or have a siesta, I would really appreciate if you contribute to the presentation. Let me tell you the format I prefer, and that's what I'm going to use. Sometimes I wish I have a mic here, but I don't. So I may be going off, this podium. So please pardon me if I go off. And if you can't capture my voice whilst I'm out there in the audience, just let me know. I'm not a talk host. I'm not Oprah. I'm not Dr. Phil. But I try to use some of their techniques. But I'm also a professor, which means professors just do what professors do. Okay. So with that said, Let me begin, and we have. Sorry. Oh, okay. That's a good idea. I can use this if I want to work around.
In fact, we're recording this, and so you want to make sure you're talking to the mic, and if anyone talks back to you, if you could pass the mic to them.
Okay.
And just make sure it's on.
All right. Well, where do we begin? As you notice, I've changed the title of this presentation slightly. The original presentation was to talk about African families of the 21st century. Of course, we're still going to do the same, but the title now is a closer look at African families beyond the media headlines. Okay. Now, why do I say that? Because the media has so much distorted images about Africa, and therefore we need to clear that out of the way before you can appreciate the message that I bring to you today. Well, what are some of the common stereotypes about Africa? Tribe versus tribal. Ethnic. Innate inferiority, exotic, wild, one with nature, hunger, starvation. Poverty, HIV, AIDS, tradition versus modern, uncivilized, and ungodly. I want to stop here for a minute and discuss these issues. Okay, and I want to get your participation in here. Now, you have the whole presentation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select a few slides, okay, and discuss them. So on your own privacy, you can go through the presentation. And as you go through to, if there are any of these slides or any of these pages you want further elaborations, we can do that during the question and answer time. Okay. So I wouldn't present everything on the slide. I'm just going to be selective. That's what I'm saying. So, what is ethnic and what is tribal? What is the difference? And why does it matter in this presentation? Sorry, we have the mic here. What is tribal, what is ethnic, and what makes the difference, and why is it important in this presentation?
I've always thought that tribal has to do with more of a common culture background, and ethnic has to do with more of a common race, like more of a, biological similarities. They don't have to be necessarily bonded in one culture.
Did he get it right?
The way I look at it, ethnic is racial. I assume that ethnic has to do with the race and a cultural race, the cultures of a race. Tribal is more social.
I'm using the Oprah style. So pardon me.
And maybe I'm not understanding the terms, but I always thought of a tribe of people as related, and ethnicity more of a larger group.
Okay, so the larger group will be unrelated.
Well, maybe related further back, but tribal would be more closely related.
Okay. Anybody here from this side? Come on, we're going to have some balance here.
Basically, I agree that a tribe. When I think of tribe, I tend to think more of in a geographical area, the people who have been in that area for a while, and they tend to be interrelated. And ethnic group is the basics of a culture that can be spread throughout a much larger area, and much more variation within it.
Okay, good. Now the harder question. Are there any tribes in Europe now? And are there any tribes in Africa?
I think tribes, at least in my mind, tend to be more olden day, like kind of more natural. Like with nature, they live outside. Kind of in Europe, you kind of think it as a modernized place versus Africa, at least kind of the stereotype. So I would say tribe in Africa more likely than Europe, although I'm sure that's not right.
All right.
It's interesting when you ask about the case of, for example, are there tribes in Europe, because you think of, we call them, for example, the Germanic tribes during the times of the Romans. In other words, it has this, seems to have this connotation of being uncivilized or something outside of the boundaries of normal civilized life that we, the collective we, know. And so that's an interesting question, because we don't call them Germanic tribes anymore, certainly, and since they've become civilized and non-barbarian, is sort of the connotation, it seems.
Well, that's good. I wanted to focus on these stereotypes as we go through this lecture, because what has happened over the years is that modernity is linked to the concept of civilization, and modernity is linked to a geographical space, and therefore Africa as a continent have been rooted out, and the images that come through are images that represent somebody's imagination. Not all these images are right, or they're put in the proper context. So what I'm going to do today is to walk you through a few ideas and make you rethink the way you look at Africa and the way even you use the word tribe from now on. A case in point. You all know something about Rwanda, right? And Burundi. You also know things about Yugoslavia, or what used to be former Yugoslavia. These conflicts happened around the same time. One was called tribal conflict or tribal war, and the other was called civil war. What is the difference? Or what were the differences? Okay, think about that. I put these questions to my students all the time before I take them overseas. And I do a lot of overseas trips. And last summer, I took a group of students from California State University to Ghana. And I asked students to write their thoughts before they left. And of course, after they came back, they wrote reflective papers. And here is one student and her thoughts about Africa before she went. Africa is a beginning for me. It is the hidden beginning of who I am, and I am here. Hidden because it is sought after by many, including myself. Hidden treasures is what comes to mind. Its rich culture and vast variety of deep meaning, and is the beginning of me because it is the origin of my ancestors' life. It also has a sole purpose in the Bible, another important and essential part of who I am. Gaining knowledge and understanding of Africa will bring to me an understanding of who I am. This student is an African-American female well, she calls herself African-American female, but technically she is 75% white, 25% black. But because of the one-drop rule, she considers herself black, and has done well. So these were her thoughts. Now, after she came back, she reaffirmed what she saw. Learning about my heritage and culture has been one of the most beautiful and enlightening experiences in my life. In Africa, the journey to discovering my culture has changed how I view my life altogether. Of course, this is not the Africa that was envisioned before I went. The image that the media displayed was the total opposite of what I encountered. American culture is contrary to African culture because of the way Africans view life. God is everything to the African. He shapes their lives. Spirituality is the basis of their very being. Now, what has all this got to do with the presentation today? Well, we start by looking at Africa, not as a country, not as a tribal groups of people, but as a continent, being the second largest continent on earth, second only to Asia. I have another slide which is not here, but when you put the United States, China, Europe, Central America into Africa, it will all fit and there will still be space left. So that's how huge, Africa is. Oftentimes when I tell people I'm from Africa, they ask, "Oh, I was in Kenya for two years. And I met this guy. Do you know him?" So, Kenya is about 6,000 miles away from Ghana, where I grew up. I cannot know this person, but I want you to understand that Africa is a continent, very diverse and very huge. And that's why the problems in Africa are also complex. Okay. What does this diversity entail? It entails 54 different countries on the continent, very diverse physical landscape, over 1,000 different languages, and the size of these countries vary. The largest country in terms of population is Nigeria, which is about 128 million, but we also have smaller countries. Maybe twice as the population of BYU, Seychelles Island is 82,000 people. There probably everybody knows each other, but not on the continental scale. Over 1,000 languages, including foreign languages, Arabic, and I'll talk about Arabic later on, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Afrikaans, and many indigenous languages. These are not dialects. They are languages, okay, which do not share the vocabulary, and you cannot understand. Even from Ghana, where I grew up, there are about 6 major languages, and I can only speak 2 and understand 2. I don't understand the rest. I don't. Okay, I haven't learned them. I hope I did, but I don't know them. The diversity also includes religion. And as you see, religious diversity includes traditional African religions that are not tribal. They are traditional. And there are also Islam, Christianity of all various types, Hindu, Jews, and there are Baha'is, and there are other kinds of religious groups in Africa. So I want you to focus on the diversity of this continent, and that is what excites me, because I'm hoping that by the time I go to my grave, I will have had a chance to visit each of these African countries. Even though I lived in Africa for a while, half of my life, and after I have been out of the continent, I've been traveling back and forth almost every year, I still don't know enough about Africa. So you can imagine yourselves not having been anywhere in Africa. Maybe all what you know is about what people like me and others tell you, or what the media tells you. Some of which may not be true, but I trust that what I'm telling you today is true from my experience. You may get another presenter from Africa, another researcher from Africa, who may have a different perspective, but that's okay, because the continent is diverse and its peoples are diverse and the opinions that people have are complex and diverse. All right? Any questions? Yes.
You have countless ethnic groups up there, but you don't have anything about tribes. How many tribes? You have countless ethnic groups up there, but you don't have tribes listed. And I wondered, going back to your original question, the difference between tribes and ethnic groups, where did the tribes fit in?
Nowhere. They don't fit anywhere. That's why I didn't use the word tribe in there. In fact, throughout the whole book, the word tribe is never mentioned. I think it's only mentioned once, but it was in a quotation. Okay, and I put emphasis on that. And I instructed all my authors to be careful about the use of the word. In fact, I threw out a challenge to them. I asked them if they could justify why the word tribe should be used in this book, they should do so, and I'll consider using the word tribe. And none of them was able to justify why today. Maybe it made sense anthropologically way back, but why today the word tribe should be used. So yes, you're right. The word tribe is not here, and it is not a word that I have used or continue to use because it has this connotation of uncivilized, uncouth, ungodly, barbaric, and have nothing to do with modernity. Okay. So let's move on. But that was a nice question, though. It means you're paying attention. You're not sleeping on me. Right? Okay. Scholarship on Africa's multiple heritage is not new. I'm not the first one doing this work, but of course I have added some things to it, and mine is a different from a different perspective and different from what others have done before. But as we go through this list, I start with Du Bois, the famous African-American sociologist, actually the first one to graduate from Harvard in 1867, I believe. His work, 1915, called The Negro, started the basis for some of the work that I do. In this book called The Negro, he talks about African people's world and links Africa back to its beginnings. Okay. Followed by Du Bois is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who led Ghana to independence in 1957. Nkrumah came to school here in the United States, and Lincoln University of Pennsylvania faced a lot of racism. He saw it in the 50s. He was determined to go back to Africa and fight for independence, which he did, and became the first president of Ghana, moving Ghana to independence in 1957 as the first country in Africa to gain independence. And after that, he wrote several books. One of the books he wrote is Conscientism, Philosophy, and Ideology. In this book, he talks about the African triple heritage and how Africa has been misperceived. The same idea was picked up by Eli Mazuri in his series in 1986 called The Africans. Those of you old enough will probably remember the TV series. The book was adopted as a TV series, 11 episodes, called The Africans. And in this book, Eli Mazuri talks about what he called African Indigenous, Islamic, and Christian heritages. Now, recently, Dr. Molefe Asante has used the same concept to talk about Afrocentrism as African-centered way of looking at the world, because all the while, the historians and anthropologists had distorted the images of Africa from their own perspective, and therefore, Africa had been studied as subjects and objects in Western imagination. So Asante brings this paradigm of Afrocentricity to the table for the presentation on Africa. So to enhance our understanding of African families beyond media stereotypes, I present to you both the diversity of the continent, historical circumstances, and cultural dynamics, how family systems have changed over time, the consequences of this change, and the challenges for contemporary families. And of course, I go into details in the book to outline how this had happened in 11 African countries, but I'm just giving you the basic stuff today, okay? What is the history of this project, a piece of which I'm presenting to you today? Well, I'll give you a personal story here. I mean, the personal story of this book started when I was born, almost about 51 years ago. Right? That's when the story started, you know, because I was born into a traditional African family. And I went to school in Ghana, you know. I went to Christian school, by the way. I went to Catholic school. I went to boys' school. I went to the boarding school. I went to the University of Ghana, which was public, secular. Then, after that, I went to Nigeria as a high school teacher. I taught 4 years of high school in Nigeria. Came to this country in 1984 to State University of New York. And 86, I came to BYU and had all the training I needed to complete my PhD, to get the skills I needed to be able to write a book. So that's the personal story of this book. See, it goes all the way back there. And now, after 17 years, I'm back to present some of the results of what BYU and other institutions had given me. So that's the personal line of this book. But on a serious note, we wanted to present basic knowledge that has been missing by the media and some of the Western literature out there. So in order to be selected to do this project, people should have the first-hand knowledge of family life and professional experience, demonstrated ability to critically analyze African families, and to provide information about African families covering a variety of areas. So we wanted to cover as many countries as possible, although we ended up covering 11 out of the 54. But we made sure that the 11 had geographical spread, linguistic spread, and religious spread. Okay. Well, that is the product you're looking at there. So let's move to talk about the historical analysis. Well, there was an Africa before the Muslims came in, and there was an Africa full of African indigenous people and the Muslims before the European Christians came in. So that is the history that we need to understand the family dynamics. So there was an Africa, Islamic came in, post-colonial historical dynamics. Then we have economic restructuring of globalization these days, sponsored by IMF and the World Bank, USAID, and maybe some of you here in the Kennedy Center know about globalization, probably more than I do, but nonetheless, this is the framework. To understand Africa, you need to have this framework. Go back to the indigenous and see how things have been evaluated. Yes, questions?
Which came to Africa first, Islam or Christianity?
That's my question.
Which came to Africa first, Islam or Christianity? Okay.
Because I thought it was Christianity.
Yes, but no European Christianity.
Right.
See, I make a distinction. See, the way I have selected these words here, I mean, look at these words carefully. See, I say Arabic Islamic religion, okay, and European Christian, okay.
Because you had the Coptic church before you had the European church, right? Like Coptic Christianity long before European Christianity.
Yes. Okay. And I'll talk about that because that started in the 4th century. Okay, so I think it's one of the slides in there. That's a good question. Was that the same question you're going to ask?
It was exactly the same question.
Okay. Okay, good. So, what is the basis? The basis is African traditional religion. Now, oftentimes, when people want to discuss African traditional religions or any other religion, they want to start with a definition. But we don't have one for African traditional religion. There's no definition for it. So what you have here are the ways that African traditional religion had been described. And Father Nyomi, a non-denominational Christian, put these things up as the definition of African traditional traditional religion. Its propagation is carried out by living it other than by preaching it. Okay? So you live it, you don't preach it. In other words, you don't go out and get converts to African traditional religion. It's never happened. Okay. Dogmas and doctrines have a very little role to play in the life of his followers. There's no separation between the religious, which is sacred, and the profane, and its influence covers all aspects of life from before the birth of a person to long after he or she is dead. And that's what Africans call the life of an individual, made up of the yet unborn and the living and the dead. Because Africans believe in the African traditional religion that your life is not separated. That if you are living now, yes, you're passing through. So you are living now because you are a soul and you are living. And the good deeds you do on earth will help you to the next stage. Because when you die, your name will never go in vain because other people are going to name their children after you. And therefore, that carries to your next world. So the kids yet to be born come through. That's also the reason why African fertilities are still very high. Because Africans believe in procreation. Because if you don't have kids, you're not going to be worshipped when you die. And if you're not worshipped when you die, your soul doesn't rest in peace. So it becomes a cycle. That is the African traditional religion we're talking about here. And that religion doesn't separate itself from economics. It doesn't separate itself from the social life. It doesn't separate itself from the family. It is all one in one. You don't go to church 7 a.m., get off church 10, and then go about your business life. It's not the African tradition. Okay. It is a holistic way of life, and life is at its center. It is concerned with it's concerned with life and how to protect it and augment it. So for the African, religion is literally life, and life is religion. If you understand this dynamics of the African religion, then you'll be able to understand all of these other aspects of it. Okay. African religion answers questions that are germane to life events. Marriage, childbearing, parenthood, death, old age. African religion copes with the human existence. Questions about human existence, questions about why we're here, what we're doing here, where we go from here, and what happens to us. But most importantly, God is omnipotent in every African society. And in every African language, indigenous language, I'm not talking about English or French or Portuguese. In every African indigenous language, there is a word for God. Okay? And I'll give you a few examples here. The African God, I believe, is the same God who had existed for all these many years. And that God is reached through intermediaries. And that's one of the differences between how Africans worship their God and how other religious groups worship their God. The intermediaries bring prosperity and good health to people, and The intermediaries help people to understand the supremacy of the group versus the individual. Well, here are a few symbols here. Can you identify any of these? Somebody has the mic. The person can pass it on. What happened? Sorry, I need to go back. Okay. Can anybody help me identify this image here? Yeah.
Those are land-team sailboats on the Nile.
Yes. Can you see me there? Yeah, I'm in there, yeah. Can anybody identify this image? Close. No, it's not Luxor. But they all have the same functions anyway. This is Abu's symbol, Ramses II temple. Okay. In this place, there are two temples. One was for Nefertiri, his wife, and this is the main temple he built. In ancient African traditions, temples were sacred places of worship and prayers. So that's an example of it. The Nile was worshipped as an intermediary to God. Everything about Egypt was the Nile. And of course, when the pharaohs died, they believed that they had to be closer to God. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza. And of course, this image here.
That's the judgment?
Yes. That is the image of the Judgment Day. Because in African traditional religion, the concepts of heaven and earth existed. And they believed that if you are good, you will die and you go to heaven. And if you're bad, what happens to you when you die? Yes. Yes. And your heart is weighed against the feather to determine how good you were when you were living. And if your heart is heavier than the feather, it means you've got to be sent back to do good before we go back there. If anybody is interested to understand the basic principles of African traditional religions, you've got to start with ancient Egypt. Because much of the knowledge we have about the rest of Africa and religion came out of Egypt. Okay, well, let's move on. What am I doing? Moving backwards? Okay, pardon me. This is, it's not a new technology to me, but this mouse is new. Okay, and this is where we were. Here are other representations of African traditional religion. Okay. Any ideas what this first one is? Okay, that's a masquerade dance in Nigeria. What about this one? What does it represent? Tombstone, yes, it is a tombstone, but it's a special tombstone because people go there to worship. And this is the concept that when Europeans came, they called ancestral worship. People go there to worship, they pray to this individual because this individual was a head of the family. So they go there and pray to him and ask for forgiveness, ask for good health, ask for many children, ask for good, land produce, and ward away evil from them. What about this? Whoever gets this right, I bet you get a $100 bill from one of us here, not me. Yes, it is. It is a church, but it's an African traditional church. Isn't it strange? Did you ever believe that African traditional religions can be housed in buildings like that? Well, why did I put this image? I put this image to contrast with this one. This is what you often see as representations of African traditional religion. You often don't see something like that. Okay. But this is the modern version of African traditional religion's house of sanctuary. This is in Ghana, by the way, where African tradition religion is coming back strong. I know we need to move on. Now, these are other symbolic representations of African traditional religion. I'm just going to run through quick so we don't run out of time. You have it in your slides. But I chose these to represent the concept of God in traditional Africa. Here, my left-hand corner here and your right hand, this individual is paying homage or praying to God. You have these, this symbol is called Jinyame. If you have been to Ghana, or those of you who know people from Ghana, ask them about this symbol. This is an ancient Ghanaian symbol, which means human beings cannot do anything except with the permission of God. That God is the creator for everything, and God knows it all. This symbol has been used all over Africa, and particularly Ghana, and you find these symbols even in ordinary household things like these pots. Okay. That is the Asante Hene, the king of the Asantes. There's a golden stool sitting by him. It's made out of pure gold. But when he dresses up, he dresses symbolically as an African. By the way, he's also a Christian. You have to focus on his story and his life, because when Christianity came, or when Islam came, there was African traditions that were laid upon that. And that's what creates the African Christian. Okay, now Islam enters Africa. See, after you've now known the basic African religion and African way of life, Africans were living peacefully, then Islam comes. So what happens when Islam comes? Well, this is the results of Islam in Africa for today. More than 1 billion people in this world are Muslims, and out of this, 50% of all Africans are Muslims. And out of this world's 1 billion people, about 25% are from Africa or are Africans. 50% of all African Muslims express their faith in languages other than Arabic. So there's Swahili, there's Twi, there's Igbo, there's Yoruba, where Islam, there's Mandinko, Hausa Fulani express themselves in Islam. How did Islam come to Africa? Islam started coming to Africa in the 7th century, okay, BC. 8th and 12th century spread through here. 12th and 15th century came through there. 19th century came through the Swahili coast and started spreading down to West Africa by the 15th century. Then by the 17th and 19th century, Muslim slave traders brought Islam to Southern Africa. So Africa had been home for 25% of the world's population, but Africa is not indigenous. Islam is not indigenous to Africa. Islam came through conversions, through jihads, through occupying territories, and through trade. You need to understand these basic structures or basic ways of transmission before you can understand what is going on in Sudan today. If you read the news about the Darfur region, you know what is going on. But the conflict there has these deep historical roots about land and occupation and Islam and indigenous Africa before you can understand that conflict there. When Islam came, there are two things that became very important. The Holy Book, called Quran, and Sharia, which is the laws that Islam or Muslims are supposed to govern themselves with. The religion is called Islam, and the practitioners are called Muslims. Okay? Well, Arabic became the language of instruction, but the framework for practicing Islam is based on what we call the 5 pillars of Islam. And these 5 pillars are all listed in your handout. So let me just run through them. Faith, prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage to Mecca at least once a year, or once in your lifetime. These are some representations of Islam in Africa. All of these are mosques in Africa. That is the largest mosque in Egypt, called the Muhammad Ali Mosque. I've been there several times. I've been inside. It's huge. That's an old mosque made up of brick in old Mali. This is the oldest mosque in Ghana, and this is House of Prayer, also mosque, the central court in one of the Egypt's mosques. Why are these important? Because African traditional religions did not necessarily have homes or places of worship. They may have shrines, but the religion was worshipped within people. When Islam came, they put up structures where religion will be practiced, even though they also practice it every day, but you've got to go to the mosque to be able to say your prayers and do other things. These are examples of Muslim activities in Africa. Well, what did Islam do to family life in Africa? I know some of you are going to sleep now, so let me get you involved. I know the mic is somewhere there, so just get ready. Preferential case and marriages of fathers, brother's daughter becomes very important in Islam, so it transformed African marriages. Strong male dominance, because before that, several African societies were matrilineal kinship systems, where women rule. And still in African traditions, women rule. Okay. But Islam, those who converted to Islam had that change. Weaker female economic self-reliance, polygyny. In the African traditional religion, men are allowed to marry as many wives as possible, and still some do. In Islam, the limitation is 4. You can go beyond 4, even if you can afford it. Okay. So what do we have at this stage? Now we have 2 cultural ideologies and religious ideologies living side by side in the African continent. The northern part mostly, the northern part mostly Islamic, and the rest of the continent mostly African traditionalists. Okay. So Islam is laid on top of Africa and changes the dynamics of family forms on the continent. I already talked about the conflict in Darfur. You can read that statement and put it in perspective so you can understand that the fight in Darfur is not necessarily between Christians and Arabs alone, but it's also between the indigenous black Africans and the invaders, Arab Muslims who came. Okay. We are dialing it forward now. We're moving to Christianity in Africa. Going back to the original question. Well, Christianity. Well, now Christianity confronts African traditional religions, but in these ancient civilizations, Kush and Kemet. Kemet is modern-day Egypt. So Christianity starts coming to Africa 4th century BC, around here. All right. So that's the 3rd to 5th century BC, the Nubians, who are the original peoples of Egypt and Sudan now, were converted to Christianity between the 3rd and 5th century. The Aksum and these Ethiopian empires were converted. Then, later on, European missionaries started coming in, 19th to 20th century, with their version of Christianity. The Portuguese came 16th century, and missionaries 20th century, 17th century, 19th century. So that is how Christianity came to Africa. But remember, there were 2 other religious organizations that existed before Christians came. The Indigenous and the Islamic, yes.
You've mentioned Sudan and the conflict that exists there, but when you see a Muslim convert to Christianity in Ghana, you don't see a conflict. Why the difference?
Well, Tim and I were talking about our next project. We're thinking about looking at patterns of settlement, religion, and ethnic identity and conflict, and whether or not it has something to do with poverty or modernization or lack of it. That's a good question. Islam, like Christianity, wherever it spread, it gained converts, but there were conflicts. Some of the conflicts were managed because the people who converted were peaceful people. So there were peaceful coexistence. In other places, there had been conflict because of lack of understanding of each other. In the Sudan, the conflict is more than religion. It is about race, and we don't have that in Ghana. Just like in South Africa, the issues about land and economic prosperity and everything is about race. We don't have that in Ghana. There may be ethnic conflicts, and there may be regional differences in terms of development and cash flow, but in terms of race, wherever there is a racial problem, these ideologies drive home the conflict. Another case in point is Zimbabwe. The conflict in Zimbabwe is about land, but why land? Because the white settlers took over all the land, and after independence, the black settlers wanted this land back. Did I answer your question? Yeah? Okay. So, this slide is very important. I want you to focus on Western European culture, Christianity, and ideological clash with Islam. This slide will also help you to understand what is going on today. Okay. Because the Ottoman Empire and Islam threatened the Byzantine Empire several years ago. The Crusaders sought to recapture Europe and the Mediterranean lands between the 10th and 14th century. Okay. Present-day France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, all came under Islam influence. In fact, the capital of Constantinople became Istanbul.
Didn't they even get to the gates of Vienna once?
So why is this relevant to Africa? Well, Europeans, remember the previous map I showed you, when Europeans started coming to Africa and bringing Christianity from the 15th century through trade, colonialism, and racist ideologies of civilizing mission, Islam was already there in Africa. So the Europeans had to confront Islam. And remember, because they had confronted Islam before, the conflict was brought with them. So what Europe wanted to do, and which they successfully did, was to colonize the entire continent of Africa. And in a conference called the Berlin Wall, they divided Africa up into colonies for themselves so that they can rule and subdue Islam. You have the list of colonial powers listed there. By the end of World War II, 90% of all Africa had been occupied by Europeans. The only two countries in Africa that were not colonized were Ethiopia and Liberia. Liberia was set up as a free colony for slaves from this country.
Those are the only two African countries not colonized?
Yes. Even for Ethiopia, Italy attempted to colonize it, but it failed. Okay. And that's why Emperor Haile Selassie, the last emperor, had become a symbol of oppression, or fight against oppression, and also the symbol for the Rastafarian movement, okay, in Jamaica. Well, what happened was new languages were introduced, and of course new forms of educational systems were introduced. Colonial schools were introduced, Western medicine was introduced, and Western healing practices were introduced. And several of these were counter to African indigenous and the Islam. What are the Western views of Islam and Africa? This statement summarizes it all. Okay, and I'm going to read it because it's an important statement. How much time do I have? Okay. I'm almost there, just pardon me. Western European expansion into the Islamic and African worlds intensified in the 19th century, fueled by Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, growing secularism, and commitment to modernization. Europe's economies and societies became a model for others to follow, and all stereotypes dominated. Western civilization was superior, and non-Western societies should take advantage to modernize, because this is what they believe, and Islam was still worthy to be feared, fear, but Muslim societies could now be pardoned and pitied to their backwardness. Sub-Saharan Africa was still occupied, the bottom of the civilization. It needed a complete transformation or reconstruction from outside. So Catholics and Protestant missionaries were among the first to start. So those are the ideologies that drove these conquerors. European Christianity and colonization instilled what is called a conjugal family model. One wife, one husband, 2.5 children, to be precise. And there were problems. Okay. You have the slides, so you can pay close attention to that. Well, the blend of European Christianity with African and Islamic traditional religions. So what happened was that people were resistant. So they had to blend the African belief systems with the Islamic, with the Christian. So that is what you have in modern day Africa going on. So there are a variety of churches and variety of places of worship. I've shown you some of these. But I want to show you these four in particular. All right? Can you recognize any of these? Which one? Yeah, that is the latest symbol. And that's the largest Mormon temple in Africa. Actually, this is in Ghana, Accra, supposed to serve the rest of West Africa. This temple was built completed in 2003, dedicated January 11th, 2004. Okay. So that's the newest. This is the oldest. This is a Coptic church in Cairo. There's a Methodist church in Ghana, and that is the largest basilica in the whole world. This is in Ivory Coast. It's not in Rome. This is in Ivory Coast. Even in the rural areas, there are churches. So you can see one local church there, up there, made up of thatch, but it's still a church. And you see this couple here, their wedding. You know, they are performing their wedding ceremonies, but in their traditional home, which is brick, you can see that, but they're dressed like probably some of you would dress when you get married, or some of you dress when you get married. So this is a blend of Western traditions with African traditions. That's a couple from Ethiopia. So where do we go from now? Which way forward? There can be no true future for Africa unless faith communities work together to promote cooperation and coexistence. And this is what is going on. Right now, several religious organizations are working together to make that happen. African traditional religion, Baha'i, Buddhism, Christianity, Hindu, Islam, Judaism, they are working together to understand Africa from this historical perspective. What are the common characteristics of African families today? We talk about mate selection and marriage, multiple marriage systems. There's no constitutional law in any one African country which says marriage should be between one man and one woman. There's none, because marriage should be fluid. That's what Africans believe. So in a country like Ghana, in Nigeria, there are 4 different types of marriages. You can marry Christian way with your one man, one wife. You can marry traditional way with multiple wives. You can marry consensually, and you can even decide not to marry, but you can have a child. Yeah. So, yes. Living together for a long period of time, then you can become husband and wife. Common law marriage, that's another name for it. Yeah. Still large families, segregated gender roles, and intergenerational relationships are very, very important. In traditional African marriages, parents are still important. This is a wedding, traditional wedding that took place in Nigeria. So these are pictures. The father there is giving blessing. Giving blessing to the marriage. There's the couple, and these are goods that are produced by the family to present. Some of you call this the bride price or dowry, or bride wealth. These things still happen in Ghana and in other African countries, including South Africa, because that solidifies the marriage. Okay, what are the challenges? Modernization, urbanization, family instability, racial and ethnic conflicts in several places, economic crisis, and most importantly, HIV/AIDS. So, in conclusion, the African family is the most authentic social institution that exists. Ali Mazrui says that in most of our languages, including his own Swahili, there's no such word as cousin because the children of my uncles and aunts are considered as my brothers and sisters. There's no such word as niece or nephew. You see, the African family is vibrant in its emotions, compelling in its loyalties. It's alive and well, living right across the continent. And from the project that took me 6 years to complete, these are some of the conclusions that came out of this work. Although African family life are central to African social institutions, African traditional social obligations of sharing, caring, and child fostering may be compromised due to HIV/AIDS and other health issues. There's also the increase in international migration, which sent Africans out of the continent, including myself. And I've been stuck here for 22 years. But I've been trying to go back and forth. So the African family dynamics is also introduced in the African diaspora. Final test for you. Does the media show you this other Africa? It's a yes or no answer. Very simple. Yes or no? No. These are all African cities. Right? Something the media will never show you. More dynamic African cities. Can you name these cities? Okay. Yeah. Which one is Johannesburg? This one? What about that? Maybe that one? What about that? What about that? Okay. That's your take-home assignment. Due next week. All of these are African cities, by the way. All thriving on the continent of Africa. Thank you.